Welcome to Women Who Kick Glass, the podcast that dives into the fearless women who changed history and the fights that are still shaping our world today. From suffragists to civil rights activists, these women refuse to back down, breaking barriers and demanding change. And now, here's your host, an advocate, a storyteller, and a woman who kicks glass herself, Ann Potenza.
If you knew that there were women who lived before us and cared so deeply about our right to vote, that they were willing to stand up against adversity, willing to be arrested for their beliefs, went to jail, went on a hunger strike to make a point and get attention that women's suffrage was important, and then had to be force-fed just so that you and I could vote. Would that make you want to get out at the next election, at any election you were able to cast your vote, to be able to be part of the 19th Amendment, the women's right to vote that these women fought so hard for? Well, Alice Paul was one of those women. She was an American suffragist who went over to London when she was in her early 20s, and she saw how Emmeline Pankhurst and the suffragettes in London were fighting for women's suffrage, and she connected with their cause, and that deeds and not words were the way that they needed to bring attention to this fight for women's rights. And she went to jail, and she was force-fed. And when she got out, she was interviewed by the London newspaper, and this is how she described her experience. "I practiced a hunger strike until November 11th. After that date, they fed me twice a day by force, except on one day when I was too ill to lie touched. I have no complaints against the officials. I spent the whole time in bed because I refused to wear prison clothes. Each day I was wrapped in blankets and taken to another cell to be fed, the food being injected through my nostrils. During this operation, the largest wardress in Holloway sat astride my knees, holding my shoulders down to keep me from bending forward. 2 other wardresses sat on either side and held my arms. Then a towel was placed around my throat, and one doctor from behind forced my head back while another doctor put a tube in my nostril. When it reached my throat, my head was pushed forward. Twice the tube came through my mouth and I got it between my teeth. My mouth was then pried open with an instrument. Sometimes they tied me to a chair with sheets. Once I managed to get my hands loose and snatched the tube, tearing it with my teeth. I also broke a jug, but I didn't give in. I do not regret my conduct and am prepared to repeat it again if necessary." That's how important women's right to vote was for Alice Paul. She went through torture in prison just to make the point that women should have the right to vote. And we owe a great deal of gratitude for her actions. After that incident, she soon came back to America and she became part of the American suffragist movement. And she was a leader in her own right. But just to think that she went through that for us, because now we can freely vote, which these women who came before us were not allowed to do. Alice Paul was born in 1885 in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. She was the oldest of 4 siblings, and she grew up on a 265-acre farm. Her father was the president of the Burlington County Trust Company in nearby Morristown, and he earned a pretty comfortable living. So they were able to have a gentleman's farm, which meant that family members were responsible for some of the tasks, but they pretty much had a labor force that worked on the farm with them. Alice's childhood years growing up a farm really laid the foundation for her lifelong civil rights work. Her parents were Quakers, and they raised their children in their faith's belief of gender equality. They also believed that their children had a duty to work for the betterment of society. Alice's family avoided materialistic pursuits and really stayed connected to nature, which was evident in their farm and in their home. Alice went to a Quaker school and she graduated first in her class. And this is something that she said about her school. "When the Quakers were founded, one of their principles was and is equality of the sexes. So I never had any other idea. The principle was always there." The Quaker belief that women and men were created equal, which was such an anomaly at the time, is why so many of these suffragists went on to follow each other into this movement. Alice grew up learning and admiring the work of Lucretia Mott and Susan B. Anthony, who were both Quakers as well. Alice's maternal grandfather was a judge who co-founded the school Swarthmore College, where Alice went on to continue her education. So while Alice was studying at Swarthmore, she was taught by some of the leading female academics at the time. Her mathematics professor, Susan Cunningham, was one of the first women admitted to the American Mathematics Associate. Alice was a very active and civilly engaged student. She was on the executive board of her student government. She was named Ivy Poetess, and she also spoke at her commencement ceremony. She also played sports like field hockey, tennis, basketball, and in her college yearbook, Alice was dubbed an open-hearted maiden, true and pure. After she graduated, she really wasn't sure what she was going to do professionally after that, but she did believe that she was going to make a positive contribution to society. She went back to the family farm for a little bit, but soon after, she moved to New York to work in the settlement movement and to start a career in social work. She started attending lectures at the New York School of Philanthropy, which led her to her work in the field of helping others. And through her work experiences, she really started noticing the gender and economic disparities present in society, which inspired her to continue this study by going overseas and studying economics. After completing her degrees in biology and sociology, Alice set sail for Great Britain in 1907, and this is what set her life on a course towards women's suffrage. When she arrived in Britain, she soon joined the Women's Social and Political Union. Yes, the organization founded by suffragette Emmeline Pankhurst. And Alice started participating in their processions, their demonstrations, and their acts of civil disobedience, all in the name of women's equal rights. And this is how it happened. One day, Alice stopped to observe a crowd loudly heckling a woman who was speaking on extending voting rights to women in Great Britain. The woman was Christabel Pankhurst, the daughter of suffragette Emmeline Pankhurst. The crowd was jeering so loudly at Christabel that she couldn't even be heard, and they basically forced her off the stage. And Alice was so upset to see this that she forced her way through the crowd and she introduced herself to Christabel. So what had been happening in Great Britain was the suffragists had been trying for a long time to get the attention for women's suffrage. They were petitioning, they were speaking, they were writing, they were doing everything to no avail. They were just being ignored. And they really had to change their method of action and really stuck to the motto of deeds, not words. So the action turned more militant, and they began heckling politicians. They started smashing windows. They started rock throwing, and this was all to get attention to the suffragist movement. So with controversy like this, it got them headlines on the front page of the newspapers, and it got people talking about women's suffrage. And this is also what led many of them to be arrested. But even getting arrested wasn't enough because they knew that they still needed to get attention, and that is why they started going on hunger strikes in prison. And the hunger strikes created more of a sympathetic feeling among the public because in that time period, this was unheard of for women to be force-fed anywhere, let alone in prison. And Alice joined that movement. She was part of it. And in an interview, she even admitted to having broken something like 48 windows in her time of protest while she was with the Women's Social and Political Union. And she went to prison as well. But Alice says that there was a quotation she saw etched on one of the prison walls that she used to take comfort from. And it said, "Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God." This sentiment wasn't invented by the suffragists that were in prison. It was first said by Thomas Jefferson and later adopted by Susan B. Anthony and later became a revolutionary cry for the suffragists who were leading the next wave of fight for women's suffrage. Alice spent a few years in Great Britain working alongside Emmeline and Christabel and the other suffragists. And when she returned to America in 1910, she really brought the cause back with her and tried to share with the other women in the movement just how much attention was brought to the women's suffrage movement in Great Britain through the actions of the women that were there. And she said, "The militant policy is bringing success. The agitation has brought England out of her lethargy, and women of England are now talking of the time when they will vote instead of the time when their children would vote, as was the custom a year or two back." She really believed that the English suffragists had found a way to the path for women's right to vote, and she worked really hard to instill that same belief in the American suffragists. So when she came back to America, she joined the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA, NAWSA. So when she joined this group and was encouraging the suffragists to follow in the footsteps of the Great Britain suffragists, there was pushback because the American suffragists were not as militant as their British sisters. But in 1913, during Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, Alice saw this as a perfect opportunity to push for a women's suffrage amendment. On March 3rd, 1913, the day before the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson, the women organized the largest parade down Pennsylvania Avenue, and more than 8,000 people marched for the women's cause, even though they faced harassment and attacks from over 500,000 people. The suffrage procession was led along the parade route by Inez Milholland, a lawyer, an activist, and a socialite devoted to the cause. Inez was symbolically dressed in Greek robes and sat atop a white horse at the front of the parade. But the parade only made it down a few blocks before the male onlookers who were not supportive of the cause started throwing things at them and attacking them and yelling at them. And the police just stood by and watched. During this time, Alice also split from the National American Women's Suffrage Association because she thought that the group was a little too conservative. And her and Lucy Stone started a new organization, which eventually became the National Women's Party. And while she was with the National Women's Party, they repeatedly tried to get meetings with President Wilson, and he would attend the meetings, but he would never commit to any action on behalf of the women's suffrage movement. And eventually, he told the suffragists that he was tired of having the same conversations over and over with the suffragists, so he decided he wasn't going to have any more meetings with the suffragist delegations. So they responded by saying, "All right, we'll send this perpetual delegation, and you won't have to see it. We will just hold up banners reminding you." And in January 1917, Alice led the National Women's Party to picket on the sidewalk in front of the White House, demanding that President Wilson support votes for women. This was the first ever protest at the White House, and they were called the Silent Sentinels. And they stood in front of the White House and picketed for 18 months. And for the year and a half that the Silent Sentinels continued to stand and picket in front of the White House, holding their banners, they were continuously verbally and physically abused by the mobs that would surround them, and the police stood by, leaving the women to fend for themselves. During the time that the Silent Sentinels were protesting in front of the White House with their banners, they were nonviolent, they didn't break any laws, they didn't disturb the peace. But the police officers started issuing them citations and then started arresting them. And as women started getting arrested, other women would start to take their place. And this started to really frustrate President Wilson. And at this time, the United States was engaged in World War I, and he was fed up and wanted this protest in front of the White House to stop. So as things started heating up and getting more tense between President Wilson and the Silent Sentinels, the police started throwing more and more of the women in jail, even though many of them were professionals and, elite society from Washington, D.C. So this really started getting the attention of the public, hearing that more of these women were being thrown to jail. And when they were thrown into jail, they were beaten, they were choked, they were being kicked, they were being chained to the bars of the cell, they were being fed disgusting food, rotting food that had worms in it, and the prisons were rat infested. It was really disgusting in the prisons. And not only were the conditions bad, but the women weren't allowed to have visitors. They weren't allowed to meet with their lawyers. So it was really an unconstitutional situation as we know it now. So to protest against these terrible conditions in the jail, Alice initiated the hunger strikes, like what she did in Great Britain. And just like what happened in England, when a hunger strike starts to jeopardize the prisoner's health, this is when they start to force feed the prisoners. So the women, the Silent Sentinels, started being force fed twice a day while they were in jail in Washington, D.C. And always willing to take extreme measures to awaken the American conscience, Alice believed that this brutality against the protesters provided excellent ammunition for the women's cause. And in a letter she wrote to one of her sister Silent Sentinels, she said, "The more harsh we can make the administration, the better." And the news reports of the women's self-sacrifice made its way to President Wilson's attention and embarrassed him. At the same time, because it was World War I and more women were entering the workforce because the men were away at war, and the women's contribution to the war effort helped persuade more Americans to look upon the women an important part of American society. And in 1918, President Woodrow Wilson finally announced his support for women's suffrage. And it was in the next 2 years that the 19th Amendment started making its way around the states for ratification. So in 1920, Alice Paul got to see her work for women's suffrage come true with the passage of the 19th Amendment, and she got to exercise her right to vote. But Alice didn't stop there. She knew with the passage of the 19th Amendment that the right to vote was very important, but it wasn't enough for equal participation in civic life. And that is why in 1923, when celebrating the 75th anniversary of the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, Alice Paul announced that she had drafted an Equal Rights Amendment calling upon absolute equality. And it stated, "Men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction. We shall not be safe until the principle of equal rights is written into the framework of our government." Originally called the Alice Paul Amendment, this was introduced in Congress every session starting in 1923 all the way through 1972 when it was finally passed. And when an amendment like that is passed in Congress, it then has a certain amount of time, 7 years, to be passed by 3/4 of the states before it becomes law of the land. The deadline passed the first time and was extended, but it still fell short by 3 states, which means the Equal Rights Amendment failed ratification. And in a more recent Congress, it was extended again and did get passed by all necessary states. And on January 17th, 2025, President Joe Biden did declare the Equal Rights Amendment as the law of the land, or as the 28th Amendment. However, as of now, the ERA has still not formally been published by the Archivist of the United States, so its legal status is still uncertain. Alice Paul's legacy as a fearless activist and leader continues to inspire generations of women and those fighting for equality and justice. So what key lessons can we learn from Alice Paul today? First, the power of nonviolent protest and persuasion. So when Alice used peaceful protests like the Silent Sentinels, she demonstrated the effectiveness of civil disobedience in challenging unjust systems and forcing political change. This tactic remains relevant in modern activism, as seen in movements like the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Protest movement, which both utilize social media and peaceful demonstrations to raise awareness and demand action. Second, her strategic political engagement. Alice understood the importance of influencing political parties and politicians. She founded the National Women's Party to hold politicians accountable and push for specific legislation like the 19th Amendment and the Equal Rights Amendment. Today, we still use this strategy when advocating for specific policy change, lobbying for legal changes, and champion candidates who support gender equality. Third, the importance of legal rights. Alice's work with the ERA demonstrated the need to enshrine gender equality in our Constitution. And while the ERA wasn't ratified when Alice Paul was alive, her work to include gender discrimination in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 showed the effectiveness of fighting for legal protections. Building on her legacy today, there are still ongoing efforts to achieve legal equality for women, including reproductive rights, pay equity, and protection from violence. Her legacy also continues through international collaboration and advocacy. Alice worked with the League of Nations, which demonstrates the importance of global advocacy for gender equality. Today, international organizations and activists continue to work towards global gender equality through diplomacy, advocacy, and international law. And finally, continuing the fight for gender equality. Alice Paul's dedication to achieving full gender equality for women, even after securing suffrage, underscores the need for our continuous activism. Her efforts trying to get the ERA ratified years and years after its introduction demonstrated her commitment to fighting for lasting change. This commitment to the ongoing struggle for equality is vital in addressing various forms of discrimination and achieving true gender equality. If Alice Paul's story inspires you, please share this episode, start a discussion, go out there, advocate, become an activist, and most importantly, please exercise your right to vote. Thank you for joining me in learning a little bit more about our nation's history, our women suffragists, and I hope that you'll come back when we explore the life of Ida B. Wells. I'm Ann Potenza, and until then, keep kicking glass.
Thanks for listening to Women Who Kick Glass. Be sure to follow and subscribe so you never miss an episode. To learn more, contact the show. Visit womenwhokickglass.com. Next time, keep kicking glass.